Hi, I'm James Taylor, business creativity and innovation keynote speaker, and this is The Creative Life, a show dedicated to you, the creative. If you're looking for motivation, inspiration, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's an author, musician, entrepreneur, performer, designer, or thought leader. They'll share with you their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, and much, much more. You'll find show notes for this episode as well as free training on creativity over at jamestaylor.me. Enjoy this episode. Hi, it's James Taylor here. Today's episode was first aired as part of International Authors Summit. This inspiring virtual summit reveals the secrets of making, marketing, and monetizing a best-selling book. If you would like to access the full video version as well as in-depth sessions with over 40 best-selling authors, then I've got a very special offer for you. Just go to internationalauthorssummit.com where you'll be able to register for a free pass for the summit. Yeah, that's right. Over 40 New York Times and Amazon best-selling authors, book editors, agents, and publishers sharing their insights, strategies, and tactics on how to write and market your first or next bestseller. So just go to internationalauthorssummit.com, but not before you listen to today's episode. Hey there, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to welcome Jay Papasan. Jay Papasan is co-author of The One Thing, a #1 Wall Street Journal bestseller with over 450 appearances on national bestseller lists and more than 30 translations around the world. Before Jay Papasan co-authored The One Thing and the best-selling Millionaire Real Estate series with Gary Keller, he worked as an editor at HarperCollins Publishers. There, he worked on such best-selling books as Body for Life by Bill Phillips and Go for the Goal by Mia Hamm. Jay also co-owns a successful real estate team affiliated with Keller Williams Realty with his wife Wendy in lovely Austin, Texas. So welcome, Jay, onto this interview.
Thanks for having me back.
So share with everyone what's happening in your world just now. What are you currently working on?
Oh gosh, we are currently hard at work trying to see if we can write a fable around The One Thing. We've been wanting to follow it up, and just to make things interesting, we thought we'd tackle, how to figure out what your purpose is. So that's been a big project this year. And we're also wrapping up work on our very first book, The Millionaire Real Estate Agent. We're updating it after, that would be 14 years of publication. Wow. They're ready for another round. So I've got 2 concurrent projects working. Most of my focus is on the fable today.
Now, I mentioned you had this other life before at HarperCollins. Did that equip you with some secret powers when it came to launching and putting your own books out into the world?
It was really helpful because at HarperCollins, I started as an editorial assistant where everybody starts on the editorial side. They make you do everything. We joyfully called it the salt mine. And editorial assistants there didn't just write jacket copy and rejection letters. When you had a contract, I would often do the first round of negotiations with an agent. We would then run it up to legal, and then when the manuscript showed up, we would work it through editorial with our editor, and then we would take it through proofreading and design. So we had to kind of shepherd the projects. And what was great is I got visibility in all the aspects of how books are actually made and marketed. Didn't always have responsibility for all the jobs, because in the beginning, as an editorial assistant, you're doing that with a senior editor, and they step in for the roles, to the sales staff, et cetera, et cetera. But you saw it all. And my big aha as an author was I learned what contracts were all about. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that would-be business authors make is that they're so happy that a publisher is willing to entertain publishing them, they don't really properly negotiate for themselves, and certainly not for the book that's going to serve their business. So that was my biggest thing that I learned that I didn't expect to learn was about contract law.
So where are I remember doing music agreements. I've done a couple of book agreements for clients, but I remember when doing the music agreements, it was always like that first page had all the things that they obviously wanted the artist to really know about, to feel good about, and then there was like 40 pages of all the reasons why they would never see money at the end of the day. So what are the traditional landmines that are in there? I don't know if in the book industry they do like cross collateralization. Is that something that happens there? What are some of the dangers that authors have to be aware of?
I think the number one thing that I tell people first is have someone negotiate on your behalf. If you don't have an agent, there are publishing attorneys. I have one. fabulous lady. She may hate me for this. Her name's Deborah Orenstein. She's in Minneapolis. She used to, I think, did contracts for Holt for many, many years. So she's very intimately involved, and she goes on a fee basis. I just pay, I don't have to pay her a percentage, and she advocates for me. So I'm a big advocate for having an advocate first, because her job all day long is to know publishing law. In the absence of that, most contracts don't have any termination clause. So essentially, whether your publishing partner is carrying their water or not, right? They're being a good partner or not. Your editor might get fired. The person who was in love with your book may leave, and then you're an orphan. You're still stuck with that publisher until the copyright expires. So is there grounds for termination? Can they actually default? In most publishing contracts, the publisher can't actually default. There's no grounds for termination. They also will own multiple books. So the language is called the option clause. And if I'm getting too nitty gritty here, just give me the throat.
This is great.
Right? I usually ask, what's the option they have? I think if they're a good partner, I'm always willing to give them a 30 or a 60-day option on my next book proposal, but they don't have a right to publish it. So I'm still a free agent. Because we were partners, I'm going to give them the first shot, and I might be willing to give them a chance to match any offer so they can keep me. But if they have an absolute option on my next work, then you may be a prisoner of a bad partner.
Okay.
And I had a good friend that signed a 3-book contract, not knowing she had signed a 3-book contract, was very unhappy with the first book. And you probably saw this in the record industry. There are some famous albums. I'm trying to think, was it The Great Rock and Roll Swindle by the Sex Pistols? Was their option album they threw together just to get out of the contract.
Yeah.
And I used to be a fan growing up as a little punk rocker in Memphis, Tennessee. So there are actually some good tracks on that. But there are some legendarily bad albums because of that. There's some really bad books because of that too. So first off, how do I end this agreement? What are their rights on my future work? And then you hit on the other one is, how do I get paid? Most publishing agreements, I want to put this politely, it's a small world. The fairest way I can say is the standard agreement is draconian. I mean, everything is tilted to the publisher, but there's also this nod, nod, wink, wink that everyone expects everyone to negotiate. So nothing is written right in stone. So you go in and say, hey, you're offering me 7.5%, I want 15%. And they'll go, great, let's go 10%. But if you don't negotiate, you've started from the worst possible financial position. So unless you're somebody, they usually give you a boilerplate contract that's everything is tilted in their favor. So those would be the top 3 for me. Is make sure you're not a prisoner to the contract itself. Make sure you're not a prisoner to future works, and make sure that you're going to be paid fairly if you deliver and they deliver.
Now, having said all that, so you know where the bodies are buried in these agreements. You know how difficult it can be with those agreements. But I noticed that with your books that you put out with, you have a kind of an interesting kind of model. So you have a publishing business, almost like an imprint, but then you go out through traditional publishers into. So you obviously can decide. I think some of the books, McGraw Hill and some. So talk to me like when you had to make that decision of like you could have absolutely just built up your own publishing, gone just purely that independent way, or you could have just gone fully into the trad side, but you chose a slightly different way of doing it. So can you just talk through your thinking there? Sure.
Well, when we first started in 2003, the world was very different. We didn't get any offers on our first book. We had one offer from Amicom for $25,000. That was our advance, and they paid bigger advances back then, so that actually wasn't a lot, given what we thought we could do. And so we self-published the book. And because Gary Keller had built a company, that's my co-author, right? We had a network to distribute it through. We actually sold 100,000 copies all by ourselves. The book was ugly. I mean, it looked like a textbook, right? Because self-publishing wasn't then what it is today. And but we sold 12,000 copies on Amazon, which was still 2003. That was still kind of a new thing. And I remember an editor saw it. We were #1 in the real estate category, and that's how we got acquired by McGraw Hill. And we went with McGraw Hill because back then there was no way for a self-published author to end up in bookstores without a publisher. And so we reserved some channels that we'd already built, and we let them have the trade channels, and that's how we ended up with that partnership for many of our books. Today, the one thing we published with the Bard Press, And there's a new breed of publishers. There's not a lot of them around. Some of the big companies have experimented with it. I think Harper had Harper Studio for a while, where essentially you're co-publishing. And that's our relationship with the one thing. Legendary publisher brings wonderful insights, has all of the power of the National Book Network for distribution and inventory, all the things that you need a publisher to do. But we essentially walk in and we're risking our money instead of asking him to risk his. So we pay for the first print run. But we also get the publisher's income on the book sales. So there's different models.
Yeah.
Right now, the publisher takes all the risk in New York, and that's why you get 7.5% of gross or whatever that is, and they get to keep whatever they get to profit on. If you go in and you're writing the check for the print run and you're at risk, you're entitled to more money. And there are more models that do that today.
And I noticed with Bard Press, they don't publish a lot of books. It's actually a very small number of books. They one a year. So they have they're putting a huge amount of focus on you as their client, have author as well. So they're only going to make that decision if they feel that they get it stacked well in their favor.
Yeah, I had to woo Ray Bard for about 3.5 years to get to work with him, and he doesn't even. So everybody's going to rush off and try to Google him and send their manuscript. He doesn't do any unsolicited manuscripts. So good luck, everybody. But there are other publishers out there like that, and now. Publishers Group West and National Book Network are two huge distribution hubs, but a lot of small publishers essentially do all of their back office through them. Inventory, supply, fulfillment, all happens through those networks. So, I mean, you can be a one-person show and effectively be your own publisher today. So it's a very different world. You would just have to have the contracts, but the good folks, I'm looking on my bookshelf, Strength Finders, right? Tom Rath. For several years, they had been with the publisher, they moved, they basically started their own imprint at one of these big distribution hubs. They circulated their own books. Eventually, I think they got bought up by Simon & Schuster or Crown, I can't remember. They ended up going back because they got a great offer. But I think today's authors, business authors, have a choice. I can self-publish, I can go with a traditional publisher, or I can look for one of these hybrid combinations where I have a job, and I have financial responsibilities attached to it, but I can get all the benefits of big publishing without necessarily some of the downsides. Fantastic. So there's just a lot more offerings out there now.
That's a great understanding of the landscape and how the landscape's changed over the years. So you wrote this, co-authored this book, The One Thing. Phenomenal book. It's probably my most suggested book that I've suggested over the past 12 months. I've just told so many people about it. It's just like one thing, and I've spoken at events and I've mentioned it as well to audiences. So there's one thing for people that haven't read the book yet. Explain the central premise of it, and then when it comes to the world, our audience of authors or aspiring authors, how can it help them?
Sure. So the big idea on The One Thing, it's been talked about so much, right? Essentially, it's focus on what matters. But the idea is giving people a process for identifying their number one priority and then giving it the bulk of their time and energy. And it sounds really simple, and it is really simple. It's just hard to actually execute. If you've tried to live the book, you know that on a day-to-day basis, focusing on your number one priority is tough. So that's 220 pages trying to walk you through why that matters, how one does it, and how one maximizes that lifestyle. Really does simplify things, and it accelerates your outcomes massively. I kind of fail on a daily basis, just like everybody else, but been doing it for 18 years with Gary Keller. I feel like I'm overall pretty focused, and I know where I should be spending my time. When I think about authors and The One Thing, when we were writing this book, we lived it. And so you identify your priority, and we call it time blocking. Gary and I just sat down and said, when are we writing? And everyone in our world for several years knew that between 10 o'clock in the morning and 2 p.m., we were holed up downstairs in our conference room. We would break for lunch, and that would be a chance for our staff to get in and, hey, what's happening? But essentially, it was 4 hours, 4 days a week. We did not write on Mondays usually because that was our day to meet with our staff. But that was our schedule. So we knew that we had a quantified amount of time to focus on this one thing, and it was big blocks of time, 4 hours.
Yeah.
This is the chairman of the board of the largest real estate company in the world, devoting that much time to one project. But that's how we got it to the finish line. And instead of it just being good, it actually ended up being pretty good results. I'll stand by the track record in the field. It's done pretty well. But we gave it tremendous energy for a burst of time, and that's how we got it to the finish line.
And there was the thing I remember very. Someone asked me about the book, and I'm going to paraphrase it. I'll probably make a really bad job of it, so you're going to have to correct me.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so when thinking about that one thing, what is the one thing that, if done well, will make everything else either easier or unnecessary?
The focusing question.
So I ask myself that multiple times a day now after having read that, but I think that's a phenomenal question just to get. It makes you pull back a little bit, and there's a lot of things you suddenly realize you don't really need to do, or not necessarily in that order.
Oh yeah, so it's very specific language, and it is a lot to remember. But once you kind of internalize it, you can kind of say, "What's my one thing?" But what's the one thing I can do, such that by doing it, everything else is easier or unnecessary. So it's one thing. It's not what are my things. Your brain is really good, in my experience, at figuring out what the one thing is. Most of the time, we actually get to the end of the day and feel guilty for not having done that thing, because it may be our number one priority, but it may not always be the easiest thing on the menu or the most pleasant thing, right? Yeah. It's just the priority. It's something that you can do. It's not that you could, should, or would. Right? Those are different verbs, and you want to think about what can I actually do today, because that gets you results. And it's so leveraged, right? We talk about the domino metaphor. It's your first domino, and it always has a bunch stacked up behind it. So when you knock it over, you just get a whole bunch of impact. Everything else is easier or necessary. And I'll tell you, everybody who started living the book, they want everything to be unnecessary. The reality is, a lot of times when you do the one thing, it just does make things a lot easier, or it postpones needing to do them. It's business. Yeah. There's still things that have to be done. You have to hit some of those things on the checklist, whether you like them or not, just because they have to be done. But it does get easier when you're doing your one thing.
And I was talking to a marketer recently, Perry Marshall, a great marketer, very good in terms of Google Ads and understanding SEO. And we were talking about the Pareto Principle, which this kind of leads from, that the idea of the 80-20 rule. And one of the things he said to me, he said, you have to realize, James, that the Pareto Principle 80-20 rule is fractal. So it essentially means 64-4 or 51. So 1% of things you do deliver 50% of the results. And then that kind of got me thinking back to, this book again, which is that, and you think, that can't be right. And you sit and figure, no, that is actually correct.
I don't know that the numbers always perfectly line up, but the principle is absolutely true. I actually did that. We have 180,000 real estate agents in Gary's company that we've incubated our publishing company out of. And I did the math last year, and 80% of all the real estate sold in our company was sold by, you guessed it, 20% of the realtors. And it was 2-0. I didn't round up or anything. And then I played with it, and 10% of them sold something like 55% of the real estate. It's still massively disproportionate. Like, you get down to the top 1%, and they're selling like 30% of all the real estate. So it is, I don't know if that's the definition of fractal or not, but it's exponential curve when you get into the smaller and smaller. If I focus on this group, I get much larger impact.
So for our audience, I'm going to imagine someone that's listening, watching to this just now. There may be a speaker, they maybe have a training business, they maybe consulting, and they want to get that first book. They have expertise in whatever their areas. They want to get that first book out. When their week is being divided amongst traveling and speaking, and then putting this workshop thing together, and then these kind of admin stuff together, how we think about that one thing. How do you kind of figure that part out, for someone like that in terms of writing that book?
Well, for writing the book, I can give you that formula. In terms of their business, it's really about their business. Like, every business has an economic model, and there's always a first domino there, right? That if you did this, everything that came after it would be better. And in our business, the first domino is giving people the book, right? I mean, it becomes the ultimate calling card for our other businesses. All of the books, we've written 11 of them, have been essentially really high-value marketing pieces. I mean, there's never been a review, please, Lord, let this be true, but out of the 2,500 reviews on Amazon, I don't think any of them says this is a marketing book. But when we looked at it, we said, we know something, and we want to share it with the world. So if you write a great book, it becomes an amazing calling card for your consulting business or your speaking business. And my friends who've written books that are public speakers have been immediately able to double their fees,
Yeah.
whether the book was a bestseller or not, because it gives them validity. I wrote the book on X, or we wrote the book on X. Therefore, you ought to have me come in and we'll talk about X. So it helps you get leads. It helps you convert leads. And it usually gets you to convert leads at a higher price point. So I see the book as a part of a great business's economic model. Like for you, it might be your product isn't a book. It might be the summit, right? What's the first domino? Books come up a lot because they are, while it can be labor intensive to create one, it's a known quantity and you can make it happen. And the people who are speaking, consulting, they already have the ideas. The challenge for them is getting them packaged in a way that's attractive to people.
And it can also, it's one of those things, obviously you're creating intellectual property there. It has a long lifespan. Like you, after you pass away plus 70 years, that's going to go to your families and relatives as well. So if we think about that lead domino being the book, then the one thing from that, because in terms of getting measurable, is it just getting that word count happening every day? That's the kind of actionable part. I mean, I remember seeing in terms of in the world of realty, seeing how the one thing was being applied there, and it was it was the number of listings. I think it was getting kind of listings. That was the kind of key. One of the key kind of KPIs. So in the case of authors, is it getting that word count happening?
I studied writing for a long time. You look at some of the greats. And, Tom Wolfe, I think he wrote something like crazy, like 10,000 words a day. Like that was his, and then I knew other people who measured it by the number of hours they worked, not their actual output. Mm-hmm. I think you should have a measurement, right? For me and Gary, it was time. It wasn't pages. We knew that time on the task would eventually yield the product we wanted. I do know people who've simply gone in and said, look, if I write 1 page a day, every year I'll generate a book. That's just how it works. Yeah. So it's something they can stumble over, but it's harder than you think to write 1 page every day.
And I think Roald Dahl, I believe it's Roald Dahl Day today as we're filming this, the children's authors, his was 7 pencils. Every day he would sit down in his little cabin and he would sharpen 7 pencils. And when all 7 pencils were blunt, that was his day. That's how he measured his day, by pencils.
It's a little different when you're writing a business book than if you're writing fiction. If I'm writing fiction, and I've done some of that, right, I think it's easier to go on word count and page count. If you're writing nonfiction, there's a process, right? You have to think about how is this book organized? Because it's not flowing out as a narrative necessarily. What are the topics I'm going to address? What's the order I'm going to address them in? And then you have to execute each of those. So the way we actually did it, if you want to know, is when we had outlined the one thing, we had broken it up into the big sections and then those sections into sections. We literally got binders, right? Old-fashioned binders. This is where we started. And for every chapter of the book, we created a section in the binder. And then we divvied it up. And I said, look, I've got, everything matters equally is a lie, right? Which is our first lie, which is where we talk about Pareto's Principle. Well, we started writing in there, what are all of our thoughts on this? What do we come to the table? We read books. We looked at our bookshelves. What have other people had to say about this? What are famous quotes and stories that relate to this? And our only job then is to pack that section with all our possible thoughts and ideas. And so there was a certain amount of time, right? And a lot of people do this over time, but we just were being very focused on it. That's how we approach books. So we have our outline. We had 2 full-time researchers helping us, but you can totally do this by yourself. You pack all the ideas in there. And then when it's time to write, I would look through that outline and be like, okay, this month I'm going to tackle this chapter. And because I'm thinking about it already, or I feel inspired to write it. And then my job is to take this massive paper, which has grown, right, into hundreds of pages sometimes of newspaper clippings. And then I start organizing that chapter. And I do the same process. Now, what are the 4 or 5 thoughts that make this chapter whole? And I break them into sections. And when I'm actually writing, I'm just taking a very thin stack of maybe 2 stories, a half dozen quotes, maybe a research study, and I'm writing that section of the book. And if you flip through the book, they call them A heads or B heads or 1 heads or 2 heads. There are little sections in the book that are complete capsulized thoughts. The opening of a chapter, the meat of a chapter, some subsection of the chapter, and the finish, right? It might only have 4 or 5 sections. Each of those has their stack, and that's what I'm working on for the week. So you've taken this really big, overwhelming project and systematically broken it into pieces. And when I show up to write, I've just got maybe 15 pieces of information, and I have to weave those together. And that creates a kind of flow. And sometimes the chapters flow from each to each. I wrote all the lies together. That took me about 7 weeks to write those 6 chapters, maybe 8 weeks. And then it took Gary, came behind me and edited them and added to them and removed from them. And it took him 3 months. So that entire process, right, was essentially 5 months to write 5 chapters. That was our process. But in the beginning, it was overwhelming.
So that at the start there, you talked about the outlining process. How long did that part? So you figuring out and having those discussions about what your main parts were. And I'd also be interested to know. You mentioned you went out through this hybrid publisher. Were you kind of creating that as almost like a book proposal, using it as a book proposal for them, or were you writing this on spec? So you were going to write the book anyway, and then you kind of went and found your partner that you wanted to put it out with.
We had the idea, and we had the big breaks. Like, this is what we think are the lies. We had a couple of big principles around it. We did not have the full outline when we pitched the book, but we had a track record. It was an idea that already existed in our company and had for a long time. So we had a lot of anecdotes and evidence to support that approach. And we had started the process because we'd maybe done this for 2 or 3 months. We'd spent brainstorming the book. And that's just flip charts and whiteboards, dedicate a few hours of lunch. So let's get together, talk about the book. And, we're reading books around the topic and we're coming back, hey, I think we should have a section on this. And we prioritized and reprioritized. I think our outline ended up fitting on 2 flip chart pages, and that was it. And then I typed it up and ran it by Ray, at the time, and he added to it. He goes, well, where's the section on how to implement it at work or whatever? And, it was a group project because we're writing as a team.
Yeah. And
our publisher was a part of that. So they definitely had input, but it was mostly Gary and I.
And I'm trying to remember also how you handled, you mentioned like the publisher was saying, something in there for a team. I'm trying to remember now how you dealt with the fact this is a book that could be read as a self-help book, but it could also be read as a manual for managers, for executives, and that's very few books are able to bridge those two worlds. And I wondered how you did that.
Gosh, that's a great question. I'm thinking we really wanted to write a business book, and there's a reason we wanted to keep the book in the business category, because we're business people, and even though the book was its own outcome for us, like that was a goal in itself, we did want it to be something that our coaching company could leverage, right? And our training company could leverage. And so we had other business outcomes behind it. So it was important for us that it lived in business, not self-help.
Okay, get it.
And the other reason is if you look at the Wall Street Journal, that's the only business list that's left. There used to be Business Week. That's gone. If you're a business author, you're either on the New York Times monthly list, the New York Times weekly how-to list, or the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal is only hardcover. Of those 3 lists, that is the most accessible to the average person. If you launch your book in hardcover and it's considered a business book, that's what it's cataloged, it really depends on the week. If you sell 1,500 to 2,000 through normal trade channels, and you're not just buying them all in one bulk sell and loading them in your warehouse. They have checks and balances for that, right? That it's real people buying the books. If you can build that much of an audience, you have a chance of getting on the Wall Street Journal list. A business person, that's a great outcome. I'm a Wall Street Journal bestseller.
Yeah.
Other books in the self-help category, the only list that you're really going to achieve is going to be either the New York Times list, which means you're competing with diet books and celebrity how-to books, which are very tough for the average business person to compete with, or the USA Today list, which combines all books, all formats. So now you're competing with Patterson and crime novels, and it's much tougher. So from a outcome standpoint, to reach our audience the fastest, we wanted to be a business book. But the nature of the topic, what's the one thing I can do, right? That's not always a business answer.
Yeah.
The one thing I can do such that, it might be get more sleep. It might be lose more weight so I have more energy when I go to work. And we ended up addressing, your spiritual life, your physical health, all those things. So it's a business book that very much applies to one's whole life. The number one first use I see for people, a lot of people use the principles to apply to their health, because we believe that's foundational to your business life. And so they go back a step. Before they get to work, they're working out. They're eating properly. So it is kind of a self-help book, but we very much wanted it to be seen as a business book first.
Got it. Because that was always something really fascinating, because you've managed to do a very difficult thing in doing that and being able to bridge those in those ways. As we start to finish up here, I'd love to know, what tools or apps do you find very useful for yourself as a writer in writing and creating all these works?
I think Evernote, everyone's going to tell you Evernote, right? Because if you do any web research, it allows you to quickly and easily organize it. So I've been a power user on Evernote for, how long has Evernote been around? I mean, I really think it's been 10 years. I might be lying. It feels like at least a decade. I've been organizing tons of notes and thoughts and pictures in Evernote. A very simple piece of technology that every writer should have. I have a notebook. It goes with me everywhere I go. And maybe call me old-fashioned, but I think better on paper. And if you know our book, the one thing, we have lots of drawings in it. And we tend to think visually, especially for a business book. 6 out of 10 readers are actually visual learners. It actually helps them to see a visualization of the idea. So that this gives me a place to do that. So I always have a place to drop my ideas. Evernote allows me to store research around those ideas. Those are probably the top 2 tools I use outside of a word processor.
And then what, if you were to recommend one book, not one of your own books, but a book, it could be on maybe the craft of writing, what would that book be?
Okay, I'm a big fan of Tim Grall's. I don't know if you're familiar with Tim or not. He marketed a lot of business books I'm a fan of, Chip and Dan Heath's books, Daniel Pink's books, and he's very scientific about it. And he wrote a book called Your First 1,000 Copies. And I give that book away a lot because it's very true. He's actually giving real numbers. He's very analytic. Yeah. He was a programmer first. And he's like, when we did a social media post, we sold this many. When we had our mailing list, we did this many. It's really a treatise, and you need to build your list if you're going to be an author.
Fantastic.
And that's your foundation of your business. And he makes the argument, I think, powerfully and truthfully. It's not what a lot of people want to hear, but that's how you build that fundamental audience. And that's a great book. Other books on just craft, like I give away, what's the Stephen King book on writing? I've given that away a million times. And I identify with that. And that's in the fiction world. But he's defending that you can still be an artist and be commercially viable. And I've always had that attitude. I mean, I never wanted to be a starving artist. I wanted to be a prospering artist, and there should be no shame around that. And it's crazy how a lot of authors and writers, like they are self-destructive because they don't want to actually, they want to be able to complain about not having success more than having success. And I don't understand that.
I think part of that is also probably the media, that it's a stereotype that's quite useful to them. So they would rather talk about, the Amy Winehouse type of story rather than the thousands of other musicians who are doing absolutely perfectly fine. They've got kids and paying the mortgage and going out and touring and doing recording. That's a less interesting story probably for the media. So it perpetuates this myth, unfortunately. I'm going to leave you a kind of final question here as we start to wrap up. I'd love to know if you had to restart. So you had none of your books were out, no one knew who you was, you knew no one in the business, and you had to restart things, but thankfully you've got all the skills, all the knowledge you've acquired over the years. What would you do? How would you restart things?
I love that. I think I would focus on building my list again, right? Because that's gone. I had a list. Like I keep it track. We have 177,000 emails right now. And that's our number one metric we track. So I would start right there again. How would I build my list? With things like Kindle singles and the ability to self-publish and reach a very large audience, I probably would try to write some very, very short ebooks around very small problems that people faced in the area I was going into, and create lots of hooks in those for people to click on and give me their email address. And it might just be, hey, here's the problem. I've built a handy worksheet for you to work through this for yourself. If you click here, go there. In my experience, we have links in our physical books But when we did a promotion with Amazon Prime and they gave away in 2 months, I think 56,000 copies of our ebooks, our reviews went through the roof and our email capture went through the roof. Because on a Kindle or on your iPad, it's very easy to click those links and actually take those actions. And so that would probably be my first tactic is, can I solve very small problems so I can write those books quickly, I can bring great value, and I can make an extra offer so I can capture them and start a conversation in their inbox. And that'll be how I'll sell the next book and the next book and the next book. And that will be the asset I'm trying to build. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. That's some great advice there. And if people want to just reach out to you more generally, like follow you on social media and things, is there a place for them to go and do that?
Because my name, Jay Papasan, I'm the only person in America that has it. I'm very Googleable. So it's very easy to find me, but I'm pretty active on Instagram. I probably post a couple, 3 times a week, and I respond to direct messages there on LinkedIn and Facebook. I'm just not as active on Facebook and LinkedIn as I am on Instagram, because that's actually my true diversion. There's no words involved. It's pictures, right?
It's just pictures. We can put nice pictures of food, nice pasta and things. So thank you, Jay, so much for coming on, sharing your knowledge, your wisdom when it comes to this. One thing, fantastic book, highly recommend it for anyone. And I wish you all the best with whatever your one thing is that you're working on just now.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
If you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.